The song sounds happy, almost uplifting. But listen closer. Stolen from Africa, brought to America. This isn't a celebration. It's a story about people who didn't get to choose where they stood and what they were asked to do once they got there. They didn't arrive as soldiers. They arrived as property. Generations passed like that. Families broken, names changed, languages erased, histories buried under someone else's flag. And then, something shifted. Not freedom, not equality, opportunity of a very specific kind. The United States was expanding, westward. It was relentless, violent, and unfinished. There were wars to fight, land to take, and frontiers to control. And the same country that had enslaved them had now found a new way to use them. Because freedom didn't mean what it sounded like. Not yet. The war had ended, but equality hadn't arrived with it. Black men could fight. They could wear the uniform. They could serve. But they couldn't vote. Couldn't sit where they wanted. Couldn't move through the country as equals. So when the army offered a path, steady pay, a place to belong, a role in something larger, for many, it wasn't just an option. It was one of the only ones they had. In 1866, Congress passed a law that allowed black men to serve in the United States Army. Not as a gesture of equality, but as a solution. They were sent west, into territories most Americans would never see. It was harsh land, unforgiving weather, under constant conflict. They built forts, escorted settlers, and protected railroads. They fought in campaigns most history books barely mention. And on the other side of those battles were people who understood something all too well. What it meant to have your land taken. What it meant to be pushed. What it meant to fight, because there was nowhere left to go. The Plains tribes had their own names for these men. Some say it came from the texture of their hair. Some say it came from the way they fought. They were fierce, resilient, and unyielding. They called them the Buffalo Soldiers. And just like that, men who had been stolen from one world were now being used to help reshape another. Not heroes, not villains. Something more complicated than that. Because this isn't a story about good guys and bad guys. It's a story about people, caught in the middle of something bigger than themselves. And what happens when survival becomes the only side you're allowed to choose? The plains weren't empty. They were alive. Nations moved across them. Not randomly, not aimlessly, but with rhythm. Following the buffalo. Following the seasons. Following the balance that had existed long before the United States ever looked west. To the Lakota, to the Cheyenne, to the Arapaho, and the Comanche, this wasn't wilderness. This was home. And home wasn't something you owned. It was something you belonged to. War existed. Of course it did. But it wasn't war the way Europe understood it. It wasn't about lines on a map or flags planted in the ground. It was about movement, survival, reputation, and courage. Raids, horse stealing, counted coup, a way of fighting where courage mattered more than destruction. Miles away, another group of men were learning those same lessons. Not by choice, but by necessity. The Buffalo Soldiers weren't trained for this kind of war. Not at first. They were used to structure, orders, formations, and uniformity. The plains didn't care about any of that. Out there, you either adapted or you didn't last long. They learned to ride harder, move faster, track signs most men would never see. They learned to fight an enemy who didn't fight the way they expected. And slowly, whether they realized it or not, they began to understand the land, the same way the people they were fighting already did. Because on the plains, there was no hiding from what something really was. Not the land, not the war, and not the truth. That two groups of people who had both been pushed, who had both been shaped by survival, were now being forced onto opposite sides of the same story. They fought across the plains in campaigns that stretched for decades. Units like the 9th and 10th Cavalry saw some of the hardest fighting on the frontier. They were there, in the long pursuit of Geronimo, trekking through terrain most soldiers couldn't read, moving for days, sometimes weeks, with little water and little rest, following signs in the dirt, broken branches, footprints most men would never notice, learning a kind of warfare they had never been trained for, but had no choice but to master. They moved through the same world as figures like Billy the Kid, a frontier that history would later turn into legend. But for them, it wasn't legend. It was orders. They fought, they endured, and many were decorated for it. But recognition didn't change everything. Because when they returned, they were still black men, and the country still deciding what that meant. And out on the plains, something else had taken shape. A kind of understanding between people who had both been pushed, both been forced to adapt, and both been shaped by survival. Some native warriors respected the buffalo soldiers for their discipline, for their toughness, and for the way they fought. Not as symbols, not as politics, but as warriors. And that's the part that history struggles with, because it doesn't fit cleanly. Men who had been enslaved, fighting against people being displaced. Respect in the middle of conflict. Honor inside something complicated. History likes clean stories. Heroes, villains, winners, and losers. But real history is rarely that simple. Sometimes it's people caught inside systems they didn't build, asked to fight battles that they didn't start, and to carry consequences long after those battles end. If you're still here, thank you. I've really enjoyed researching and telling these stories, and I really hope you're enjoying hearing them. I've got lots more like this, but if you've got an idea for a story you'd like to see me cover, drop it in the comments. While you're at it, like, subscribe, and share. And as always, welcome to the Underground Syllabus.